I love how aggressively Jorden Van Foreest has been playing in this Tata Steel tournament. So he had his 9th decisive game of the tournament today in round 13 versus Sam Shankland, but did Jorden walk away with the win, or was it Sam? Well, let's have a look and see here. Jorden had white, Sam had black, and if you love a daily chess video, do hit that subscribe button to never miss a daily video. So Jorden went for a quieter opening here. He just started with this London system, bishop to f4, and Sam goes in for the immediate c5 now, and bishop e2 came from Jorden, so not say c3 here or knight b to d2. Often this bishop sits well on d3, so a slightly quieter variation here. We had knight to c6, castles from white, and the immediate capture in the centre here. The pawn recaptured, bishop d6, we had this exchange, bringing the queen in, pawn to c3, castles from black, and rook to e1. And now Sam wants to play pawn to e5 here, but I would argue that he should have prepared this move with something like rook to e8 here. Now say white plays something like knight to d2. If you go e5 in this position, then this line is different to the game, because after this exchange on e5 here, queen recaptures, bishop f3, well here you can actually get a couple of the heavy pieces off the board, and this is good for black when you've got the isolated queen's pawn here. Now it's easier to defend. You could go say bishop to e6, and generally speaking getting those heavy pieces off the board favours you when you're trying to defend an IQP. But we didn't have this on the board. Sam, instead of going rook to e8, he went for the immediate pawn to e5 here, as we'll see. So in this position, pawn to e5 straight away. Now that was captured, the knight recaptured, we had this exchange here, and now after bishop f3, there's no captures here, there's no rook on e8. So Sam jumped in with the knight, but this all looks a tiny bit rocky now in the middle of the board, as we can see. Knight to a3 was now played by Jorden, excellent move. It might look strange putting it there and not on say d2, but actually you want it to head for this key d4 square to blockade that isolated pawn. So we had bishop to f5 now, knight to c2, rook f to e8, and now queen d4. And although at times you want to keep the queens on the board when you're playing against this pawn, here the exchange is good for white, because you put an uncomfortable question to black. Do you want to put that bishop on g6, which could have been played, wasn't played in the game, and now if c4 is played, you can actually capture that pawn because your knight is defended twice. Or do you want to do as Sam played in the game, which is play bishop to d7? And the reason he went for this move is because if the bishop sits on g6, you're not obliged to play c4 as white. And the knight can start hopping into b5, the bishop wouldn't cover that square, and it all gets a little bit rocky for black with the rook then coming to the d file. So Sam plays for piece activity instead, but it does allow pawn to c4 now. You can't take here or you're losing your knight on e4. So after this move of pawn to c4, we had king to f8, and black is just accepting that this pawn will be lost, but he'll get his pieces to good squares. And now taking on d5 immediately is the best move here, but instead Jorden throws in this move pawn to h4, and Magnus said, let me just explain why this move was played. Jorden's played this move because it looks cool, so I won't try and further any explanation on that. Now we had rook a to c8, and now the pawn got captured on d5. We had knight to d6 now, so a great blockading square. Knights are excellent blockaders, and we can see that the black pieces look wonderful, both the minor pieces and the rooks on the open files. So these positions are really tough to actually win for white, especially when your bishop is blunted like this by the pawn. So we had rook takes here, and now a slightly strange decision from Sam. Instead of taking with the king, he took with the bishop, but okay, still not a fatal move. This position is balanced. Rook d1 came now, the bishop came back to d7, king h2, king e7, and now this policy of advancing on the king side was undertaken. We had h6, h5, king f6, king g3, and now rook to c4. So black is getting plenty of piece activity, as we can see here, for the pawn. Not easy for Jorden to make progress. Now he goes king f4 here, walking into a pin. It did give Sam the option of going to knight b5, but then king e3 comes. You're not losing a piece or anything. We could have had a mass simplification like this. King takes, king e7, king e5. f6 kicks the king out. It would come back here, and then the king sits on d6. Once again, it's really tough for white to win this position because you can't make inroads. You'd love to get your king to g6 here to mop up these pawns, but crossing this bishop line is just really tricky. So we didn't have any of this. After the move king to f4, Sam goes rook to c5 instead. He's just kind of shuffling here, saying I'm fine. How are you going to proceed with the position? Jorden goes rook to d2. We had g5 check now. You want to kick this king back if you can. So we had en passant takes, pawn recaptures, rook d1 here. And now you want to at some point swing this rook across to the h-file, but not just yet. So we had rook a5 from Sam, probing on the queen side, pawn a3, knight c4, and this might be looking very uncomfortable for white now, because there's no rook d2 of course, but Jorden finds an excellent way to defend here, best move in the position, knight to b3. So he counterattacks against the black rook here, so that if you take this pawn on b2, you can't play like this because takes, and you're losing a knight at the end of the line. So there's no time to take on b2. Instead, the rook moves away. But now obviously it begs the question of, well, what's going on here? So knight d2 was played, another excellent move. And the whole point of this is you can't take the pawn with the rook or you're simply losing a knight. And if you take with a knight, then knight e4 check is really strong. You kick the king back and the rook can hop up to d4. As we can see, this knight now has no squares to actually jump to. It's completely dominated by the rook. And basically the white pieces are getting super active now. Material's still level, so it was worth giving the pawn back for. So Sam didn't want to go in for this. Instead of taking on b2, he first played g5 check, kicked the king back, and took the knight on d2 here. The rook recaptured, and the rook sat on b3. So it's a really nice defensive setup for Sam. There's a lot of pressure being exerted here, a bit uncomfortable, and you're tying the rook down to the defense of this pawn. So king g2 was played coming out of the pin, king e5, rook e2 check, king f6, rook c2, king e5, rook c7 makes an inroad, but only temporarily. The king kicks that rook away. And now rook c1 was played. Really interesting stuff. So leaving this pawn on prise, because then rook h1 comes. And actually this is a bad transition for black, because this is falling with check, and white's doing quite well here, because the kingside pawns are just going to be a bit faster than the queenside pawns. So black didn't go in for this. Instead, rook b6 was played, and the whole idea is that if now rook h1 to attack that pawn, you step the king out of the way and defend the pawn laterally. So b4 was played first, king e5 came anyway, rook c7, the king dropped back, rook c3, and now a5 from Sam. So a nice move, breaking up the queenside pawns and trying to get his own b pawn going down the board at some point. So the pawn was captured here, the rook came to b5, and the rook dropped back to c1. So what we'll see here is that black is mopping up on the queen side, but white is mopping up on the king side here. So it becomes a race, and it's a technically equal race, even though white is ahead pawns. But black has to tread so carefully now. So the king jumped up, we had rook h7 hitting the bishop, king d6, rook h6 check, king c5, rook h7, king d6 here. Is Jorden going to repeat? Of course he's not. Rook g7, he's really fighting this tournament. So we had pawn to b5, rook takes on g5, pawn b4, so passed pawns need to be pushed, rook g8, and the idea is that you're preparing to swing to b8 and get behind that pawn. There are also themes of putting the bishop on e4 here and stopping the advance of the pawn like that. So now Sam actually makes a terrible mistake. So he should push his pawn here. Basically it's critical that he pushes and keeps this one tempo, because now if Jorden plays pawn to g5, which he did in the game, you can go bishop f5 here. Now you really are going to queen this pawn if white doesn't react, so white would have to come across with the rook, and there's a dynamic kind of balance here because the pawns are well blockaded as we can see, and it's hard for white to actually make progress. Not that white couldn't have kept on trying, but we didn't have this. In the game, Sam played rook a5 here, so he's preparing to bring the rook to b5 if rook to b8. And Jorden actually could have played that move already and been doing really well. Instead, he goes pawn to g5. Now we had pawn to b3, g6, b2, and this is the point. Jorden actually doesn't mind this pawn queening now because he's queening a step ahead, and that makes all the difference. So rook b8 now stops the pawn, rook b5 interposes, we had the exchange here, bishop captures, g7, b1 queen, and I should clarify black queens first, but after the queen here, it doesn't actually make a difference because this is a token check. The king comes up to g3. If you check again, you can simply block with the bishop. If you try and pin like this and win a piece, well, white can just get back with the queen soon via checks and actually defend that one, and then you're just 2 pawns ahead. As it was in the game, Sam tried this move here, queen to d3. We had queen to e6 check, and basically there's just a big run around of the king now, as we can see. The game's completely lost. You can even go for the queen trade, that's no good, the connected passes will be winning. We had queen e6 check, king d8, and these moves now just steadily improve the position. There's nothing black can do, there's no perpetuals available, and after these sequence of moves here, queen to g5 check, black actually resigned because mate is soon coming. And the only move here is actually king to e8, and then you drop a bishop with check. Awesome game by Jorden and a fantastic attacking tournament. If you enjoyed this game, then do consider subscribing to the channel, and see more amazing Tata Steel games, click here. Thanks very much for watching, and see you soon.